Welcome to Apex Storyteller, your place for soothing stories to guide you into a peaceful night. If you enjoy these tales, please like and subscribe. It helps me share more calming stories with you and others. Drop a comment to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's begin this relaxing journey together. The creaking windmill at the edge of town spun lazily in the distance, its rusted blades screeching like a warning. Henry sat on the porch of his rundown house, staring at the horizon where the sun was just a smudge of orange. People whispered about his town, how it wasn't on any map, how no one ever left once they arrived. Tonight Henry would learn why. Henry turned the envelope over in his hands. It felt heavier than it should have, the paper damp and gritty, as if it had been buried and then unearthed. There was no name, no address, just the faint imprint of something smeared on its surface. What? He couldn't tell, but the sight of it made his stomach churn. The porch creaked beneath him as a cold gust swept through, carrying with it the faintest whisper. Henry froze, the hairs on his arms standing on end. It wasn't the kind of whisper you could ignore, it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Henry? The voice was soft but distinct, almost like a sigh. He whipped his head around, scanning the empty street. The pale light from the single working street lamp flickered, casting jittery shadows that seemed to dance and twist unnaturally. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. Silence. He clenched the envelope tighter and stepped back inside, bolting the door behind him. The moment the lock clicked, a faint thud came from above, like someone walking in the attic. Henry's heart skipped a beat. The attic had been sealed shut for years, ever since his father disappeared. His mom had always refused to go up there, saying it was just filled with junk and bad memories. "Leo?" he called, his voice cracking slightly. No response. He glanced down the hallway toward his brother's room. The door was slightly ajar, just as he'd left it. The soft glow of a night light spilled into the hall, a comforting sight amidst the growing unease. Another thud. It was deliberate now, like footsteps moving closer to the attic's trapdoor. Henry's grip on the envelope tightened as his breath quickened. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, just the wind, the old house settling, but deep down he knew better. The envelope. He had almost forgotten about it. His trembling fingers worked to tear it open, revealing a single folded piece of paper inside. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, as if the writer had been in a hurry or terrified. "Do not stay past midnight. Leave." Henry felt the blood drain from his face. Midnight. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 11:47 p.m. A soft creak sounded from above, directly over his head. He looked up. The attic door, which had always been bolted shut, now hung open slightly, revealing nothing but darkness. "Nope," he muttered, backing away. His hand reached instinctively for the phone on the kitchen counter, but when he tried to dial his mom, the line was dead. The lights flickered. "Leo?" Henry bolted down the hallway, flinging open his brother's door. The bed was empty. Panic set in as he scanned the room, his eyes darting from the closet to the window. The window. It was open, the curtains fluttering in the cold night air. "No, no, no," he whispered, climbing out onto the porch roof. His heart pounded as he scanned the yard below. There, at the edge of the overgrown grass, was Leo. He stood perfectly still, facing the woods that bordered their backyard. "Leo?" Henry shouted, his voice cracking. He scrambled down the side of the house, landing awkwardly on the ground. As he approached, his brother didn't move. "Leo, what are you doing out here?" Henry asked, grabbing his shoulder. Leo turned slowly, his face pale and his eyes wide, but it wasn't fear in his expression, it was something far worse. "They're here," Leo whispered. "Who's here?" Henry demanded, shaking him gently. But Leo didn't answer. Instead, his gaze shifted to the woods. Henry followed his line of sight and froze. Between the trees, shadows moved, not the natural kind cast by moonlight, but shapes that slithered and twisted unnaturally. They had no form, no faces, but they watched, their presence heavy and suffocating. "Inside." "Now," Henry ordered, pulling his brother toward the house. As they ran, the air seemed to thicken, each step feeling harder than the last. The shadows didn't follow, but their gaze burned into Henry's back. Once inside, he locked every door and window he could find, dragging furniture to barricade the front door. Leo sat on the couch, his knees pulled to his chest, muttering something under his breath. "What are you saying?" Henry asked, crouching in front of him. Leo's eyes flickered to him, glassy and distant. "They don't like when you know their name." "What? Who?" Leo pointed to the envelope still clutched in Henry's hand. Before Henry could respond, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. A whisper echoed through the room. "Henry?" This time it wasn't from outside. It was right behind him. Henry froze. The whisper was unmistakable, soft and cold, as though someone had exhaled his name right against his ear. He turned sharply, his hands fumbling for something, anything, to defend himself. But there was no one there. The room felt wrong. It wasn't just dark, it was suffocating, heavy, as if the walls themselves were pressing inward. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old house had gone silent. "Leo?" Henry called out, his voice shaking. No response. He groped for his phone in the darkness, the faint glow of the screen casting eerie shadows across the room. The time read 11:59 p.m. His chest tightened. The note had warned him, "Do not stay past midnight." A soft giggle broke the silence. It wasn't Leo's voice. It came from the corner of the room where the shadows seemed thicker, darker. Henry's breath hitched as he strained to see through the gloom. The giggle came again, faint and childlike, but there was a cruel edge to it, like nails scraping against glass. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The shadows shifted. Henry's phone flickered and died, plunging him back into complete darkness. He stumbled toward the couch where Leo had been sitting, his hands sweeping the empty air. "Leo? I'm here." The voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to guide him. He found his brother huddled beneath the coffee table, trembling. "Stay close to me," Henry said, pulling Leo out. His hands were ice cold, his small frame shaking uncontrollably. "They're watching us," Leo murmured. "Who? Who's watching?" Henry pressed, trying to keep his voice steady. Leo just pointed toward the window. Henry hesitated, then turned slowly. The curtains hung still, the glass reflecting the faint glow of the street lamp outside. But then he saw it, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the outline of a tree or a passing car. This shadow moved, its edges rippling like water. And then it pressed against the glass. Henry's breath caught. The shadow had no face, no features, but he could feel its gaze. It leaned closer, and for a horrifying moment he thought it might come through. He grabbed Leo and bolted for the hallway, slamming the door to the living room shut behind them. "Go to Mom's room," Henry ordered, pushing his brother toward the bedroom at the end of the hall. "But what about?" "Just go." Leo ran, his footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. Henry turned back toward the door. He could hear the faintest sound of scratching, like nails dragging across the wood. And then the whisper came again. "Henry, let us in." The voice wasn't alone this time. It was layered, multiple tones overlapping, creating an eerie, discordant sound. He backed away, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst. His mind raced. What do they want? Why now? The scratching stopped. Silence. Henry's stomach churned as he realized the absence of sound was worse. He crept toward the door, pressing his ear against it. Nothing. Then a loud bang made him stumble back. It wasn't the front door. It came from above. The attic. Henry's blood ran cold. He had forgotten about the open trapdoor. "Henry?" Leo's scream shattered his thoughts. He sprinted down the hallway and burst into his mom's room. Leo was standing by the window, pointing outside. "They're in the yard." Henry hesitated, then forced himself to look. At first, he saw nothing but the overgrown grass swaying in the wind. But then the shadows moved again, gliding across the ground in unnatural patterns. One of them stopped and turned, or at least it felt like it turned. It had no eyes, no features, but Henry could feel its focus shift to him. "Get down," he hissed, pulling Leo away from the window. "What do they want?" Leo whimpered. "I don't know," Henry admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Not the front door. Not the living room. It was coming from the attic. Henry's skin prickled. He had no choice. If they stayed, the things outside would get in. And if they ran, whatever was in the attic would come for them. The knock came again, louder this time. "Stay here," Henry said, though every instinct screamed for him to do the opposite. "No, don't go." Leo clung to his arm, tears streaming down his face. "I'll be right back," Henry promised, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. He grabbed the flashlight from his mom's nightstand and stepped into the hallway. The attic trapdoor loomed above him, slightly ajar. A faint creaking sound came from within, like someone swaying back and forth on their heels. Henry aimed the flashlight upward, the beam cutting through the darkness. The attic was just as he remembered it, cramped, filled with dusty boxes and cobwebs. But now something was wrong. At the far end, a figure crouched low, its back to him. It rocked slightly, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Hello?" Henry's voice was barely audible. The figure stopped. Slowly it began to turn. Henry didn't wait to see its face. He slammed the trapdoor shut and bolted it, his hands trembling. The thudding began immediately, shaking the house. "Henry?" Leo screamed again from the bedroom. Henry ran back, his flashlight casting wild beams of light down the hallway. When he reached the bedroom, his heart sank. The window was wide open, and Leo was gone. The window swung gently in the cold night air, the curtains fluttering like ghostly hands. Henry's breath hitched as he stood frozen, staring into the empty space where Leo had been moments ago. The faint sound of crickets chirping outside only amplified the suffocating silence that had fallen over the room. "Leo?" Henry shouted, leaning out of the window. His voice echoed into the stillness, swallowed by the oppressive darkness that cloaked Hollow Creek. There was no answer, only the distant rustle of leaves. Henry's hands trembled as he grabbed the flashlight, aiming it toward the yard. The beam cut through the night, revealing the overgrown grass, the edge of the woods, and nothing else. The shadows he'd seen earlier were gone, but he could still feel their presence, lingering just out of sight. His mind raced. What just happened? Where could he have gone? Henry scrambled back inside and yanked the curtains shut, as if that thin layer of fabric could somehow protect him from whatever was out there. His heart pounded so violently it felt like it would burst from his chest. And then he heard it. A faint whisper, so soft it was almost a breath. "Henry, come find me." The voice was unmistakable. It was Leo's. "Leo?" Henry called out, his voice cracking. He spun around, searching the dark corners of the room. "Where are you?" The whisper came again, this time from the hallway. "Help me." Henry felt his blood run cold. His legs moved on their own, carrying him out of the bedroom and into the narrow, pitch-black hallway. The flashlight flickered as he moved, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The whisper grew louder. "Henry, please?" It was coming from the attic. Henry stopped, his body paralyzed with fear. The trapdoor was still bolted shut, but something was off. The faint creaking he'd heard earlier had returned, accompanied by a low, rhythmic tapping. "Leo?" he called out again, though every part of him screamed to turn and run. The tapping stopped, and then the whisper turned into a laugh, a soft, guttural chuckle that echoed through the house. Henry's chest tightened as he aimed the flashlight at the trapdoor. His hands shook as he reached for the bolt, pausing for just a moment. This is a bad idea, a terrible idea. But he couldn't leave Leo. With a deep breath, he slid the bolt back and pulled the trapdoor open. The ladder creaked as he climbed, the darkness above swallowing the light from his flashlight. The attic smelled of mildew and decay, the air heavy with the scent of something long dead. "Leo?" Henry whispered, his voice trembling. The beam of light swept across the attic, revealing old boxes, cobwebs, and broken furniture. Nothing out of the ordinary, until his flashlight landed on the far corner. There, crouched on the floor, was Leo. "Leo?" Henry scrambled toward him, relief flooding through him. "What are you doing up here?" But as he got closer, his steps faltered. Something was wrong. Leo was facing away from him, his body unnaturally still. His head was tilted at an odd angle, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. "Leo?" Henry's voice wavered. He reached out a hand, but before he could touch him, Leo turned. Henry staggered back, his flashlight trembling in his grip. Leo's eyes were wide and glassy, but they weren't his eyes anymore. They were pitch black, empty voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. His face twisted into a grin too wide, too unnatural. "You shouldn't have come," Leo said, his voice layered with something inhuman. Henry stumbled backward, tripping over a box and landing hard on the floor. The flashlight rolled out of his hand, its beam casting erratic shadows across the attic. Leo, or whatever was pretending to be Leo, rose to his feet. His movements were jerky, like a puppet being yanked on strings. "Leave," the thing hissed, its voice a grotesque symphony of tones. "Leave before they take you too." Henry scrambled to his feet, grabbing the flashlight and pointing it at the thing. The beam flickered, and for a moment, it wasn't Leo standing there. It was a shadow, tall and featureless, its limbs stretched unnaturally long. Henry bolted. He nearly fell down the attic ladder, slamming the trapdoor shut behind him and sliding the bolt back into place. His chest heaved as he leaned against the wall, his mind racing. That wasn't Leo. That couldn't have been Leo. But if it wasn't, where was his brother? The house was silent again, but it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was oppressive, a heavy weight that pressed down on him from all sides. Henry's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. They were coming from the living room. He gripped the flashlight tightly and moved cautiously down the hallway, his every step slow and deliberate. The living room door was slightly ajar, a faint sliver of light spilling out. Henry pushed the door open and froze. The room was empty, but the furniture had been rearranged. The couch, the chairs, the coffee table, they were all pushed to the edges of the room, leaving a large empty space in the center. And in the middle of that space was a single, small object. The envelope. Henry's stomach churned as he stepped closer. The envelope looked different now, darker, as if it had soaked up the shadows of the room. He reached down and picked it up, his hands trembling. Slowly, he unfolded the note inside. The message was different this time. "It's too late." The lights flickered, and the whisper came again, louder this time, surrounding him. "Henry, Henry, Henry." The walls seemed to close in, the shadows writhing and twisting. Henry backed away, clutching the envelope tightly. And then the front door slammed open. Henry spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Standing in the doorway was Leo. But his face wasn't right. The sight of Leo standing in the doorway froze Henry in place. The faint glow of the street lamp outside cast an eerie light over his little brother, accentuating the wrongness of his appearance. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they weren't human anymore. They were too dark, reflecting nothing but emptiness. "Henry," Leo said, his voice distorted, echoing in an unnatural way. "Why did you leave me?" Henry's breath hitched, his mind screaming for him to move, but his legs refused to obey. I didn't leave you," he stammered, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. "You disappeared. I've been looking for you." Leo took a slow step forward, the floorboards creaking under his weight. His movements were off, jerky, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. "Why didn't you help me?" Leo asked, his head tilting at an unnatural angle. "I'm trying to help you." Henry's voice cracked as he backed away, his pulse racing. "What's happening to you, Leo?" A smile stretched across Leo's face, too wide, too sharp. His teeth were jagged, glinting in the faint light like shards of broken glass. "You can't help me now," Leo whispered, his voice layered with something inhuman. Henry's back hit the wall, and he realized he had nowhere left to go. His mind raced, searching for something, anything, to do. And then Leo lunged. Henry ducked at the last second, scrambling past his brother and bolting for the hallway. He didn't dare look back, but he could hear the sound of footsteps chasing after him, heavy and relentless. "Don't run, Henry," Leo's voice echoed, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. "You'll only make it worse." Henry burst into his mother's bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind him. His hands trembled as he pushed the dresser in front of the door, creating a makeshift barricade. For a moment there was silence. Henry pressed his ear against the door, straining to hear any sign of movement. And then came the knock. Slow, deliberate. It wasn't loud, but each knock sent a jolt through Henry's body. "Let me in, Henry," Leo's voice called from the other side, eerily calm now. "I just want to talk." Henry backed away, his chest heaving. His flashlight flickered, the room plunging into brief moments of darkness. He felt like the walls were closing in, the shadows growing longer and more menacing. His eyes darted to the window. It was his only way out. He grabbed the flashlight and threw it at the glass, shattering it into jagged pieces. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers. Henry climbed onto the windowsill, the broken glass cutting into his hands, and jumped. He landed hard on the ground below, pain shooting up his legs. But he didn't stop. He ran. The yard felt endless, the tall grass grabbing at his ankles as if trying to pull him back. The shadows seemed alive, writhing and shifting with every step he took. And then he saw them. Figures standing at the edge of the woods. There were dozens of them, their bodies barely more than silhouettes against the darkness. Their faces were blank, featureless, yet Henry could feel their gaze boring into him. He stumbled to a halt, his chest heaving as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. One of the figures stepped forward. It was Leo. "Henry," the figure said, its voice overlapping with countless others. "Come back." Henry took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. "You're not Leo. Stay away from me." The figure tilted its head, mimicking the unnerving motion Henry had seen earlier. "We are all Leo now." The other figures began to move, their steps slow and deliberate, their bodies gliding through the tall grass without a sound. Henry turned and ran toward the road, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The town was silent, eerily so, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. The streetlights flickered as he passed, plunging him into brief moments of total darkness. He finally reached the old church at the center of town, its towering steeple casting a long shadow over the empty streets. The heavy wooden door creaked as he pushed it open and slipped inside, slamming it shut behind him. The air inside was damp and musty, the faint scent of burning candles lingering despite the church's apparent abandonment. Henry collapsed onto one of the pews, his body trembling with exhaustion. He wasn't safe, but he needed a moment to think. The whispers returned, faint and distant, like a breeze rustling through leaves. "Henry?" He shot up, spinning around to find the source of the sound. The church was empty, but the whispers grew louder, filling the vast space. The candles lining the altar flickered, their flames bending unnaturally as the shadows on the walls began to shift. Henry's eyes widened as he saw them, faces forming in the darkness. Dozens of them, their features twisted into grotesque shapes. "Leave this place," the voices said in unison, the sound reverberating through the church. "He is ours now." Henry clutched his head, the overlapping voices becoming unbearable. "What do you want from me?" he screamed. The shadows surged forward, coalescing into a single form. It towered over him, its body writhing with countless faces, all of them staring at him with soulless eyes. "Join us," it whispered, its voice a sickening mixture of pleading and command. Henry backed away, his heart pounding as he searched for an escape. The shadows closed in, the air growing colder with each passing second. And then he saw it. A single ray of moonlight streaming through the broken stained glass window above the altar. It was faint, but it was enough. Henry bolted toward the altar, grabbing one of the heavy candelabras and swinging it wildly at the shadows. The light seemed to repel them, their form flickering and dissipating like smoke. The voices screamed, a deafening cacophony that made Henry's ears ring. He didn't stop. He climbed onto the altar and smashed the stained glass with the candelabra, letting the moonlight flood the room. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into the walls. The voices faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Henry collapsed to his knees, his body trembling. But the silence didn't last. From the darkness, a single voice emerged. It was Leo's. "Henry, you can't escape. Not now." Henry's body trembled as he sat on the cold stone floor of the church altar, clutching the remnants of the candelabra. The moonlight streaming through the shattered stained glass window bathed the room in an ethereal glow, but it offered little comfort. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as Leo's voice echoed once more through the empty chamber. "You can't escape, not now." Henry's head snapped toward the sound, his flashlight trembling in his hand. It was faint at first, a soft, almost mournful wail that seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards. He clutched his chest, forcing himself to steady his breathing. "It's not real," he told himself. "It can't be real." But then the wail grew louder, a bone-chilling sound that seemed to seep into his very bones. The pews creaked as if unseen hands were running along their wooden edges. Shadows danced along the walls, their movements unnatural and erratic. The once holy space felt alive with malevolence, as if it had been waiting for him. Henry bolted upright, his instincts screaming for him to leave. His legs wobbled as he sprinted toward the door, but the moment he reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. The wailing turned into a guttural laugh, echoing from every corner of the room. "Stay," a voice growled, deep and gravelly, as if the very building was speaking to him. Henry yanked on the door with all his strength, panic overtaking him. The door didn't move. It felt as though the house itself wanted him to stay. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, his breath visible in the frosty air. The floor beneath him felt colder, heavier, and then he noticed it, the faint outline of something moving just beneath the surface, as if the floorboards themselves were alive. A hand, pale and skeletal, shot through the wood, clawing at his ankle. Henry screamed, stumbling backward and falling onto the floor. His flashlight rolled away, its beam flickering as it landed on the altar. The skeletal hand was joined by others, each one grasping and pulling as if trying to drag him into the earth. He kicked frantically, his foot connecting with one of the hands. It recoiled, but the others tightened their grip, their icy touch burning his skin. "No!" Henry shouted, his voice breaking as he clawed at the floor, trying to pull himself free. The shadows closed in, the room spinning around him as the wailing grew louder and louder, almost deafening. The hands pulled harder, dragging him inch by inch toward the gaping hole that had formed in the center of the floor. And then he saw them. Faces. Pale, gaunt, and eyeless, staring up at him from the darkness below. Their mouths moved silently, as if whispering a curse meant only for him. Henry's fingers found the flashlight, and in a desperate act, he swung it at the nearest hand. The light seemed to burn the skin, causing the hand to retreat into the hole. He didn't waste a second. He scrambled to his feet and ran toward the altar, his eyes scanning for anything he could use. His gaze landed on a large iron cross hanging on the wall. It looked heavy, but it might be enough. With every ounce of strength he had left, Henry yanked the cross from its mount. It came loose with a loud crash, the sound reverberating through the church. The hands reappeared, reaching out for him from every direction. Shadows writhed and twisted, forming grotesque shapes that loomed over him. Henry swung the cross, its sharp edges cutting through the air. The hands recoiled and the shadows hissed, retreating slightly but not disappearing entirely. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice echoing through the church. The wailing stopped. For a moment there was silence. And then a single voice spoke, soft and menacing. "You think you can fight us?" Henry turned, his flashlight trembling as he aimed it toward the source of the voice. In the corner of the room, where the shadows were darkest, a figure began to emerge. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and bending at unnatural angles. Its face was featureless, save for a mouth that stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You brought this upon yourself," it hissed, its voice echoing like 1,000 whispers. Henry backed away, clutching the cross tightly. "I don't know what you are or what you want, but I'm not staying here." The figure tilted its head, its movements eerily slow. "You've already stayed too long." The ground beneath Henry's feet began to quake, the floorboards splintering as the darkness crept closer. He turned and ran, leaping over the pews and heading for the window. The shards of broken glass from earlier still clung to the frame, jagged and glinting in the faint light. Without hesitation, he threw himself through the opening, landing hard on the ground outside. The night was eerily quiet, the air thick and suffocating. Henry scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving as he looked back at the church. The building stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But Henry knew better. The wailing had stopped, but the whispers, they were still there, faint and persistent, carried on the wind. "Henry," they called, soft and haunting. He turned and ran, his legs carrying him as fast as they could. The streets of Hollow Creek blurred around him, the familiar landmarks now twisted and foreign in the darkness. The whispers followed him, growing louder with every step. They were everywhere, in the rustling leaves, in the creaking of old buildings, in the very air he breathed. He reached his house and slammed the door shut behind him, locking it and collapsing against it. His body trembled, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. But as he sat there, gasping for breath, he realized something was wrong. The house was silent, too silent. And then he heard it. The faint sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. Henry's blood ran cold. He gripped the cross tightly, his knuckles white. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving toward the staircase. "Henry?" It was Leo's voice again, but it was different this time. It was softer, almost pleading. "Help me." Henry's heart ached. He wanted to help his brother, to believe that he could somehow fix this. But the fear was overwhelming. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs, and Henry braced himself. And then the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, consuming everything. Henry's breathing quickened as he felt the air grow colder. And then, from the darkness, a voice whispered right beside his ear. "You can't run from us." The darkness felt alive, wrapping itself around Henry like a suffocating shroud. He clutched the iron cross against his chest, his heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the faint creaks of the old house. The whisper that had just brushed against his ear lingered in the silence, its icy breath still prickling his skin. He forced himself to take a shallow breath, trying to calm the rising tide of panic. But the stillness was broken by a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the staircase, slow and deliberate, as if each step was a calculated announcement. Henry's mind screamed for him to move, but his body felt paralyzed, glued to the spot against the door. He stared into the inky void of the hallway, squinting in vain to find a shape or shadow. "Henry?" The voice came again, softer this time, almost mournful. It was Leo's voice, or something pretending to be Leo. "Help me." "No," Henry muttered under his breath, shaking his head violently. "You're not him." "Stop it." The tapping stopped abruptly, plunging the house into an unnatural silence. Then came the sound of something sliding, like claws scraping against wood. Henry forced his legs to move, staggering toward the living room. He needed light, anything to push back the encroaching shadows. His hand found the old gas lantern on the table, and with trembling fingers, he lit the wick. The soft, flickering glow filled the room, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Henry exhaled a shaky breath, clutching the lantern tightly. But the relief was short-lived. The room around him began to change. The wallpaper peeled away, revealing blackened, rotting wood beneath. The air grew thick with the stench of decay and the temperature plummeted. He could see his breath fogging in the dim light. And then he noticed the whispers. They were faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, like the murmur of a distant crowd. But they grew louder, layering over each other until they became an unintelligible cacophony. Henry spun around, the lantern casting frantic arcs of light. The shadows on the walls seemed to move independently, stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes. "Stop," he shouted, his voice cracking. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew closer, louder, until they were all around him. He covered his ears, but it was no use. The sound was inside his head, worming its way into his thoughts. Images flashed before his eyes: Leo's pale, distorted face, the gaping hole in the church floor, the writhing shadows. And then something new, a door. It was massive, made of ancient, dark wood, with strange symbols carved into its surface. It stood in a place of complete blackness, and yet Henry felt an inexplicable pull toward it. The vision faded as suddenly as it had come, leaving Henry gasping for air. What was that?" he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. But the house didn't answer. The whispers faded, replaced by a soft, rhythmic creak. It was coming from upstairs. "No," Henry said, backing toward the front door. "I'm not going up there. I'm not." The sound of footsteps interrupted him, heavy and deliberate, descending the stairs. Henry froze, his grip tightening on the lantern. He turned slowly, his eyes fixed on the staircase. The lantern's light caught a figure descending the steps. It was Leo. But it wasn't the Leo he remembered. His skin was ashen, stretched tightly over his skeletal frame. His eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to suck in the light. His head tilted at an unnatural angle as he stared at Henry. "Henry," Leo said, his voice distorted, echoing in a way that made Henry's stomach churn. "Stay away," Henry shouted, holding the lantern out in front of him like a shield. Leo didn't stop. He moved closer, his steps slow and deliberate, his bare feet leaving dark, wet marks on the wooden floor. "Why did you leave me?" Leo asked, his tone almost childlike, filled with sorrow and accusation. "I didn't," Henry cried, tears streaming down his face. "I swear I didn't." The shadows in the room began to writhe, coiling around Leo like living things. His mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, and his voice changed, becoming deeper, inhuman. "You can't escape us, Henry. No one escapes." The shadows surged forward, snuffing out the lantern's light. Henry screamed as the darkness enveloped him, the cold seeping into his bones. And then he was falling. The sensation was disorienting, as if the ground had vanished beneath him. He fell through the black void, his body weightless and tumbling. When he finally hit the ground, the impact knocked the air from his lungs. He lay there, gasping, his hands scraping against rough, cold stone. The darkness was absolute, but as his eyes adjusted, he began to see faint, glowing symbols etched into the floor around him. They pulsed with a sickly green light, casting eerie shadows on the walls of what appeared to be a cavern. In the center of the room stood the door from his vision. It was massive, looming over him like a sentinel. The symbols carved into its surface glowed faintly, pulsating in time with the light on the floor. Henry pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling. The pull toward the door was stronger now, almost irresistible. "Don't," a voice whispered from behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. The cavern began to shake, the ground rumbling beneath his feet. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. "Open it." The command hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to his knees. He clutched his head, trying to block out the sound. "Open it, or they will suffer." Henry's mind raced. "They," he muttered, and then he saw them. The faces of everyone he had ever cared about. His mother, his friends, even people he barely remembered. Their expressions were twisted in pain, their mouths moving silently as if screaming. "Stop," Henry shouted, tears streaming down his face. The faces faded, replaced by the door, its pull now unbearable. Henry staggered to his feet, his body moving almost of its own accord toward the door. He placed his hands on its surface, the carvings burning into his skin. The whispers stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it made his ears ring. And then, with a deafening crack, the door began to open. The door creaked open, its massive weight groaning against unseen hinges. A cold wind poured through the widening gap, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far worse, something primal that made Henry's stomach churn and his knees weaken. The green symbols around him flared brightly, casting long, flickering shadows across the cavern walls. Beyond the threshold of the door lay nothingness, an infinite void that seemed to swallow light, sound, and even hope. Henry's hands trembled as he stepped back, his mind screaming at him to run. But the pull from the door was relentless, stronger than fear, stronger than reason. From the darkness, shapes began to emerge. At first, they were faint outlines, barely distinguishable from the void. But as they moved closer, their features became horrifyingly clear. They were grotesque, twisted parodies of human forms, too tall, their limbs bending in ways that defied anatomy, their faces smooth and featureless except for gaping mouths lined with needle-like teeth. Henry stumbled backward, clutching the iron cross tightly in his hand. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Stay away." The creatures didn't heed his plea. They moved in unison, their steps eerily silent, as if the ground itself refused to acknowledge their presence. "Henry," one of them said, its voice a distorted echo of his brother's. "You brought this upon yourself?" The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. "No, I didn't mean to." "You opened the door," another one hissed, its voice layered with countless others. "Now you must face what lies beyond." Henry turned to run, but the cavern was shifting. The walls seemed to stretch and ripple, the symbols on the floor twisting and rearranging themselves. The exit was gone, replaced by more of the black void. "Please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "I just want to go home." The creatures paused, tilting their heads in unison as if considering his words. Then one of them spoke, its voice colder than the wind that poured from the door. "There is no home. Only us." Suddenly, the void beyond the door pulsed with life. A low, guttural sound emerged, like the growl of a beast too large to comprehend. The air grew heavy, pressing down on Henry's chest and making it nearly impossible to breathe. The creatures parted, forming a path as something massive began to stir in the darkness. Henry's heart pounded as a shape began to emerge, a figure far larger and more horrifying than the others. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its every step shaking the cavern. When it stepped into the light, Henry's mind reeled. Its body was a shifting mass of shadows and tendrils, constantly writhing and reforming. Its face, or what passed for one, was a swirling vortex of darkness, punctuated by a single glaring eye that seemed to pierce directly into Henry's soul. The eye focused on him, and a voice boomed in his mind, bypassing his ears entirely. "You have called me?" Henry fell to his knees, clutching his head as the voice filled his thoughts. "No, I didn't mean to. I didn't know." Ignorance is no excuse. The tendrils extended, wrapping around Henry's body and lifting him into the air. They were cold, slimy, and impossibly strong. He struggled, but it was like fighting against a storm. "You have opened the door," the voice continued. "Now you shall become part of it." The tendrils began to pull him toward the door, toward the void. The closer he got, the colder and heavier the air became, until it felt like he was suffocating. "No," Henry screamed, thrashing wildly. "Please don't do this." His cries were met with laughter, low, guttural, and inhuman. The creatures watched silently, their eyeless faces turned toward him as if savoring his despair. As his body crossed the threshold, Henry's mind was flooded with images. He saw the church, the wailing hands, the faces of the people he loved. He saw his brother Leo standing in the doorway of their childhood home, smiling before his features twisted into something monstrous. And then he saw the town of Hollow Creek. The streets were empty, the buildings decayed and crumbling. The people were gone, their voices replaced by the whispers that had haunted him for days. "This is your legacy," the voice intoned. "To feed the void. To join you." Henry's vision blurred as the void consumed him. The last thing he saw was the single, glaring eye, its gaze unrelenting. And then there was nothing. Amelia stood in the sterile, silent hallway of the hospital, the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. It had been a long shift, too long, but something was off tonight. She felt it, a chill creeping up her spine. The lights flickered above her, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She turned the corner to check on her last patient, but the door was wide open, and the bed, it was empty. Confusion sank in. She'd just checked the room an hour ago. The patient was there. She swore it. Then a faint noise, a whisper, came from the far corner of the room. Not a sound she recognized. Her breath hitched and she stepped closer. "Hello," she called, her voice shaky. No response. Just the soft click of the door slowly swinging shut behind her, as if someone had been waiting. Her pulse raced. She wasn't alone anymore. But who, or what, was watching her? Amelia had always prided herself on her ability to stay calm under pressure. As a doctor, she had faced the worst of human suffering, accidents, critical cases, and sometimes death itself. But tonight, in the quiet corners of St. Elmo's Hospital, her resolve was beginning to falter. The clock on the wall above her station ticked slowly, the second hand dragging along like it was stuck in syrup. It was nearly 2 a.m. The hospital had a different feel at this hour. Empty, quiet, the sterile smell of antiseptic stronger than ever. Her shift had been long. Too long. The exhaustion was starting to creep in, blurring the edges of her thoughts, making her question things she usually wouldn't. The hallways were silent, save for the occasional shuffle of footsteps or distant, muffled conversations from the nurses' station. Everyone else had gone home, leaving only the skeleton crew behind, the people who stayed for the graveyard shift. Amelia pulled herself from her desk and stood, stretching her stiff neck. She glanced at the charts in front of her, scanning the list of patients she had yet to check on. Just a few more rounds, she whispered to herself, trying to muster the energy for the next task. She wasn't sure why, but she felt a growing unease. Something felt different. Shaking it off, she grabbed her flashlight from the drawer, the plastic cool and reassuring in her hand. As she made her way to the first patient's room, her shoes clicked sharply on the polished floor. Room 306. The elderly man, Mr. Harper, had been in a coma for weeks. His condition had remained unchanged for days. It was routine now. Check on him, adjust his make sure the machines were running. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as she approached the door, she noticed something strange. The light in his room flickered. Not the usual buzzing you might get from an old bulb, but a steady, rhythmic pulse, almost like a heartbeat. Her brows furrowed and she stopped just outside the door. The feeling in her gut tightened. It was probably nothing. She pushed the door open slowly, peering inside. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of the monitor next to Mr. Harper's bed. The light above him was dim, casting long shadows on the walls. But there, just beyond the doorway, the bed was empty. Her heart skipped a beat. She was sure she'd left him there. She had just checked on him an hour ago. She stepped inside, her breath quickening as her eyes scanned the room. The sheets were neatly folded, the pillows fluffed and untouched. There were no signs of struggle. Amelia swallowed hard. Had someone moved him? But the night nurse had left over an hour ago, and the door had been locked. She would have noticed if anyone had come in. "Mr. Harper?" she called softly, stepping deeper into the room. Her voice trembled more than she'd like to admit. "Mr. Harper, are you here?" No response. She turned on her flashlight and swept it across the room. Her eyes darted to the corner, to the space where a chair sat by the window. It was empty, but the eerie quiet was unbearable. Everything in her mind screamed at her to leave, to get out of this room before something worse happened. But her feet stayed planted to the floor, as if the weight of her own curiosity was holding her there. Then, just as she was about to turn and leave, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. "Amelia?" Her heart lurched. She froze, the flashlight slipping from her grasp. She swore she had heard it. Someone had called her name. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper now, as if speaking any louder would make the very air heavier. "Is someone there?" Nothing. She bent down to pick up the flashlight, but as her hand touched the cold floor, she noticed something odd. The carpet by the door was pushed up, like someone had dragged it aside. Slowly she reached for it, pulling the edge back, and there, beneath the carpet, was something shiny. A key. Her stomach churned. This wasn't just some misplaced item. The key was too clean, too deliberate. Without thinking, Amelia pocketed the key, her mind racing. She didn't know what it unlocked, but she had a terrible feeling it was important. She left the room quickly, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every step. As she walked down the corridor, her footsteps echoed louder than ever before. She tried to shake off the sense of dread that was tightening around her chest, but it clung to her like a shadow. The hospital was quiet, too quiet. Every corner seemed to hold something waiting for her. When she reached the nurse's station, she paused. The lights here were flickering too, but it wasn't the same rhythmic pulse as in Mr. Harper's room. This was random, sporadic, as though the building itself was struggling to keep the lights on. Amelia glanced around, but the station was empty. No nurses, no staff. Confused, she stepped over to the desk to check the schedule. The time was wrong. No, the clock was running backwards. Her breath hitched. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. The second hand moved counterclockwise. She stumbled back, her chest tightening in panic. She shook her head, trying to clear her vision. But the clock wasn't the only thing off. The hospital, once familiar, felt wrong, like it was twisting, folding in on itself. The walls seemed closer now, the hallways stretching out into impossibly long tunnels. A scream echoed from somewhere deeper in the hospital. It wasn't one of fear, but one of pain. A shrill, gut-wrenching cry. Amelia's legs moved before she could stop them. She ran toward the sound, her mind racing with questions. Who was it? Why did it feel like everything was slowly falling apart around her? She rounded the corner toward the emergency wing, the hallway stretching on for miles. The door at the far end was open. She could see the faint glow of lights inside. As she got closer, she felt the air grow colder. And then, just as she was about to push the door open, it slammed shut on its own. A sound like a whisper, an impossible, inhuman whisper, drifted from the other side. You shouldn't have come. Amelia froze, the blood draining from her face. Who was on the other side of that door? And why was she hearing things she couldn't explain? Something was very, very wrong. Amelia's hands shook as she slowly backed away from the door. The words, "You shouldn't have come," still hung in the air, vibrating against her skull. A cold, oppressive silence followed, thick enough to swallow her entire existence. Her breath came out in shallow gasps, her heartbeat a loud thud in her ears. She had to get out of there. The hospital, once so familiar and comforting, now felt like an alien world. The walls, which had always been a source of stability, seemed to stretch and distort in her peripheral vision, closing in around her. The door that had slammed shut was just one of many strange things that had happened tonight. Amelia turned away from the door, her legs unsteady as if they were no longer in control. She moved quickly, her footsteps echoing in the narrow hallways, the long, sterile corridors that were now filled with an unsettling tension. The lights above her flickered again, casting brief shadows that seemed to dance just out of sight. She made her way toward the stairwell, thinking maybe the fresh air would help clear her mind. Her hand gripped the railing, cold and clammy under her touch, as she descended into the hospital's lower levels. It was even quieter here, almost unnaturally so. The faint hum of the hospital's machines above her only made the silence more oppressive. The lights were dimmer in this part of the building, the air thicker with the stale smell of antiseptic. Amelia had worked at St. Elmo's for years, but she had never come down to these lower levels unless it was for an emergency. This part of the hospital was rarely used anymore, long ago deemed unnecessary after the newer facilities had been built. But tonight everything felt off. The very air felt charged, as if something was watching her from the corners of the darkness. As she passed by the old patient rooms, she noticed something strange. The doors were open, all of them, even though she knew she had locked them earlier. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer to one of the rooms. It was empty, save for the dim light casting long shadows across the walls. But it wasn't the emptiness that unsettled her, it was the faintest trace of something else. A smell, not the clean, clinical scent she was used to, but something musty like old paper or rotting wood. She turned her head quickly, her flashlight shaking in her hand as she moved to the next room. But she froze mid-step. There, at the far end of the hall, a figure stood at the doorway of the last room. A woman. Amelia's throat tightened as she squinted into the dim light. The woman's back was to her, but something about her posture made Amelia's stomach churn. The woman was unnaturally still, and for a brief moment, Amelia could have sworn she saw something wrong with her. The faint outline of the woman's form shimmered like a heat wave, wavering as if she wasn't quite real. She wasn't sure if she was seeing things, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The woman was wearing an old-fashioned white dress, something that looked like it belonged in a different era. A nurse's uniform, perhaps, though Amelia couldn't place it. And the figure, it seemed to be slowly swaying as though caught in a breeze, though the air around them was still. "Hello?" Amelia called out, her voice trembling as the words left her mouth. She could hardly believe herself. The woman didn't respond, not even a shift in her posture. Amelia's gut twisted, and her first instinct was to run. But her feet remained rooted to the floor, her eyes unwilling to look away. Then something inside the room shifted. Amelia's heart leapt into her throat as the woman slowly turned her head, her face now visible in the dim light. But it wasn't a face at all. It was a blur, a distortion, like a photograph that had been smeared, the features stretched and contorted into something that couldn't possibly be human. The eyes, hollow and wide, stared back at Amelia with an intensity that chilled her blood. The mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, the skin pulled too tightly around it. The edges of the woman's face seemed to flicker in and out of focus. Before Amelia could react, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, like a bad dream fading away when you wake up. But Amelia couldn't shake the image. The face, the eyes, the impossibility of it all. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she stumbled backward, her mind screaming at her to leave, to get out of the lower floors and back to the safety of the upper levels. She turned and ran down the hall, her heart racing as she made her way to the elevator. But just as she reached the doors, they opened on their own, revealing the same dark, empty space she had just fled from. Her breath came in short gasps as she stepped back. She didn't want to go back down there. She didn't want to face whatever was waiting for her. She turned toward the stairs instead, hurrying back up the steps to the first floor. Her hands were slick with sweat as she gripped the railing. When she reached the main floor, the familiar sounds of the hospital returned. The soft beeping of the machines, the faint chatter of the staff in the distance. It felt almost like a relief. But the unease still clawed at her chest, gnawing at her sanity. She could still feel the presence of something watching her just out of sight. She rushed to the nurse's station, her heart still hammering in her chest. The clock on the wall now read 3 a.m., but something was wrong with it. The time was moving backwards again. "What the hell is happening here?" she whispered under her breath, her hands shaking as she grabbed the nearest chart. That was when she heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A dragging noise, like something heavy scraping across the floor. Amelia spun around, her eyes scanning the hallway. Nothing. The noise came again, closer this time. Slowly, she turned her head toward the sound, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. At the far end of the hall, the figure was back. It wasn't the woman this time. It was a man, his body shrouded in shadows, his face obscured by the darkness. But there was something about him, something that sent a wave of nausea through her. He wasn't walking. He was dragging himself along the floor, dragging his body like something not fully alive. His legs were bent at odd angles, twisted and broken in ways that made Amelia's stomach lurch. His arms scraped across the floor, and every inch of his movement was accompanied by the sound of wet, sticky dragging. Amelia froze, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move, couldn't look away. The figure stopped in front of the nurse's station, his face still hidden in shadow. And then, slowly, he lifted his head, and Amelia saw his eyes, dark and empty, hollow like those of the woman. And then, in a voice that was nothing more than a rasping whisper, he said, "You should have left when you had the chance." The hospital was suffocating. The walls, which had always seemed so sterile and comforting to Amelia, now felt like they were closing in on her. The air was thick with a tension she couldn't explain. Her legs shook as she hurried through the corridors, the sound of her own breathing harsh in the silence. It felt like everything in the hospital was alive, watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the man from the lower level. But the hallway was empty. The echoes of his dragging footsteps were still fresh in her mind, and the image of his broken, contorted body lingered like a nightmare that wouldn't fade. "Focus," Amelia muttered to herself, forcing her feet to move faster. She had to keep going. She couldn't let herself break down, not now. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was happening before it drove her completely mad. She reached the nurse's station, her hands trembling as she gripped the counter. The clock was still running backward. The second hand twitched erratically, moving in unpredictable jerks as if mocking her. She felt a shiver crawl up her spine. Every second was slipping further out of her control. The lights flickered once more, casting the room into momentary darkness. And then, when the lights returned, everything had changed. The walls weren't just white anymore, they were stained with something dark, something that looked like old blood, smeared in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Her stomach churned, and she backed away from the counter. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just the deep, heavy silence that seemed to swallow her whole. A sudden sound broke through the stillness. A soft whisper, so faint it could have been the wind. "Amelia?" She froze. The voice was close, too close. It came from behind her, from somewhere in the room, but when she turned around, there was nothing. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice barely more than a whisper itself. But her words felt swallowed by the oppressive silence that lingered like a thick fog. There was no answer, just the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above her. But then, just as she was about to turn and leave, the whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent. "Amelia, you should have left." The voice sent a jolt of panic through her. It was almost as if it was coming from the very walls themselves, seeping into the air, filling every corner of the room. Without thinking, Amelia spun on her heels and rushed down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay in the nurse's station any longer. Every instinct told her to run, to escape whatever was happening here. But the hospital was no longer familiar. The hallways twisted in impossible directions, like a maze that was constantly shifting. She had walked these corridors 1,000 times before, but now they seemed unfamiliar, bigger, darker, and more oppressive. The doors that used to lead to the staff rooms were now locked, and the patient rooms that once opened easily were now sealed shut with heavy, rusted locks. She stopped in front of the elevator. The button was glowing faintly, but the numbers above it flickered, distorting in a strange pattern. She didn't want to take it, but it was the only way out. With a deep breath, she pressed the button. The doors opened, revealing an empty shaft. Her hand hovered above the button for the ground floor, but the elevator didn't move. Instead, it jerked suddenly, and then a low, grinding sound filled the air. The doors slammed shut with a loud bang, trapping her inside. Amelia's breath caught in her throat as the floor beneath her feet seemed to shift. The elevator started descending slowly, but it wasn't a smooth motion. The floor seemed to sway beneath her, almost like she was floating. Amelia gripped the railing, trying to steady herself. Her pulse raced as the elevator creaked, groaned, and dropped with a sickening lurch. And then the lights flickered out, plunging her into complete darkness. Amelia's breath quickened as the temperature dropped, the air becoming colder and colder. Her flashlight, which she had kept tucked in her pocket, flickered on, casting long, jagged shadows across the elevator's walls. And then she heard it. A soft scraping sound like nails against metal. Her heart skipped a beat. The noise was coming from somewhere above her, but there was no one else in the elevator. No one could have climbed in without her hearing it. The scraping grew louder, more frantic. Then it stopped. In the sudden silence, Amelia felt a chill wash over her. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was pressing in from all sides. And then she saw it. A shadow, just a flicker at first, moving across the wall in the corner of the elevator. Amelia turned her head quickly, her flashlight following the shadow's movement, but there was nothing there. Her pulse raced, her mind spinning. Was it her imagination? Had she been working too long? Was she hallucinating? But as the shadow continued to shift and grow, it began to take shape, slowly, grotesquely, as if something was crawling toward her. It wasn't human. The figure was misshapen, its body bending in unnatural ways. Its arms were too long, its hands grotesque claws scraping along the walls. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was a mass of skin stretched too thin, its mouth an open, gaping hole. Amelia gasped, stumbling backward against the elevator wall. Her breath came in panicked gasps as she pressed herself as far back as she could, but the figure wasn't stopping. It was coming closer. The scraping sound grew louder. The thing was getting nearer. "Please no," Amelia whispered, her voice cracking as she tried to push herself against the elevator doors. But they wouldn't open. They were stuck, sealed shut. The creature, if it could even be called that, reached for her, its claws elongating, its mouth widening in a soundless scream. "Amelia," it whispered her name, the voice now unmistakably her own, twisted and wrong, echoing through the confined space. The darkness consumed her. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the hollow, empty eyes of the creature, locking with hers. A chill shot through her body, as if her very soul was being pulled into the depths of the darkness. Then everything stopped. Amelia's eyes snapped open. A harsh light stabbed at her retinas, and she instinctively raised a hand to shield herself. She was lying on something soft, a hospital bed. The beeping of machines echoed faintly in the background, the steady rhythm of her own pulse thumping in her ears. Her breath came in sharp gasps, as though she had just surfaced from drowning. Confusion clouded her mind. The last thing she remembered was the creature in the elevator, its grotesque, contorted face, its nails scraping the walls, the dark whispers that had filled the space around her. She had been sure she was done for. But here she was in a hospital room, alive. For a moment she thought she had imagined it all. The terror, the shadows, the suffocating atmosphere, it seemed so unreal now that she was here, back in a place she knew well. But deep down, Amelia could still feel the lingering presence of the hospital's dark force, its oppressive weight bearing down on her chest. She sat up slowly, feeling the remnants of fear crawling under her skin. Her hands trembled as she wiped the sweat from her brow. Everything was blurry, but she could make out the familiar white walls, the machines, the sterile smell. It was supposed to be comforting, wasn't it? But the very air felt wrong, like it was poison, thick with something she couldn't quite place. She tried to push herself out of bed, but the moment her feet hit the cold floor, a wave of dizziness hit her. Her head spun and she stumbled. She caught herself on the edge of the bed, gripping the metal frame until the vertigo subsided. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of what had happened. Had she been knocked unconscious? How long had she been out? Before she could get any answers, a voice broke the silence. Amelia? The voice was soft, barely a whisper, but there was no mistaking it. It was the same whisper she had heard before back in the hallway, the same voice that had come from the walls. She froze. The sound seemed to come from every direction at once, filling the room with a bone-chilling presence. It wasn't just a voice, it was a force, a feeling, a malevolent energy that tugged at her very soul. Amelia, you shouldn't have come back. She spun around, her heart hammering in her chest, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the silence deafening. Her breath caught as she looked over at the door. It was shut, and yet the air around her was thick with the sense that something, or someone, was watching her. Her pulse quickened as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They filled her mind, drowning out her own thoughts. The words were clear now. You're not supposed to be here. You never should have stayed. Amelia's hands balled into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she tried to steady her racing thoughts. She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt tight, like the walls of the room were closing in on her, suffocating her. Stop it, she muttered under her breath, but the whispers only grew louder. She knew then that it wasn't just a voice. It was the hospital itself. It was alive. The walls, the machines, the air, it was all connected, all part of some dark force that was far beyond her understanding. Terror gripped her. She had never believed in ghosts, in curses, or anything supernatural. But after everything she had seen, heard, and felt, she knew deep down, that something unspeakable had taken root here. Something that had always been here, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to consume whoever dared to stay too long. Amelia grabbed her head in her hands, her mind spinning. She needed to get out. She needed to leave this place. But her legs felt heavy, like they were chained to the floor. The whispers stopped abruptly, and a terrible silence fell over the room. Amelia's breath hitched as the room seemed to tilt again. The lights flickered once more, casting eerie shadows that crept up the walls. For a moment, she thought she saw something move in the corner of her eye, something standing just outside the threshold of the door. But when she turned to look, there was nothing. She was being hunted. The realization hit her like a cold slap. The hospital wasn't just haunted, it was a trap. It was feeding on her fear, growing stronger with every passing moment. And if she didn't find a way out, it would consume her too. Her gaze darted around the room, looking for any means of escape. There was no window, just a small, barred ventilation grate on the far wall. It was a dead end, just like the hallway she had wandered through earlier. The sense of being trapped, cornered, overwhelmed her. And then, as if summoned by her panic, the door creaked open. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She froze. No one had come in. She hadn't heard footsteps. The door had simply opened by itself, revealing the hallway beyond. But the hallway was different now. It wasn't the sterile, familiar hallway she had passed through earlier. The walls were now cracked, the paint peeling in thick, yellowed strips. The air was thick with the stench of mildew, and the lights buzzed overhead, flickering erratically. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, like the calm before a storm. The whispers returned, this time louder than before. Amelia, they called her name again, echoing down the hallway. Come see what you've awakened. A chill ran down her spine. She didn't want to follow the voice. She didn't want to go into the hallway. But her legs moved against her will, dragging her forward. The door seemed to beckon her, pulling her into the darkness beyond. She couldn't stop herself. With a deep, trembling breath, Amelia stepped into the hallway, her feet heavy with dread. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. The hallway stretched on before her, endless and oppressive. The whispers grew louder with each step, crawling into her mind, taking root in her thoughts. And then, as if from the very walls themselves, a voice spoke, low, guttural, and full of malice. You're not alone, Amelia. The temperature in the hallway dropped suddenly, a biting cold seeping into her skin. Her breath came in visible clouds, and her pulse raced as she turned to run. But as she did, the walls seemed to shift, pushing in on her, closing off the exit. She was surrounded, trapped. Every shadow seemed to twist and writhe, taking on forms that could not possibly be real. She could feel eyes on her, eyes watching from the darkness. She could hear the scraping again, the same sound she had heard earlier coming from behind her. Amelia's heart thudded painfully in her chest as she spun around, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. But the sound of dragging feet grew louder, and the floor beneath her seemed to tremble with the weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting. She had awakened it. With a final, desperate glance behind her, Amelia ran. She didn't know where she was going or how she would escape, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever had been waiting for her in the dark was closing in. The horror had only just begun. Amelia's breath came in shallow gasps as she ran, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, too loud, too frantic. She had no idea where she was going, she was just running. The sense of being hunted was overpowering, like something was right behind her, just out of sight, stalking her every step. The air was suffocating, each breath like inhaling ice-cold needles. Her heart pounded violently against her chest, and her legs felt as though they might give out at any moment, but she pushed herself to keep moving. She had to get out. She had to survive. The hallway twisted, bending and warping as she ran, like the very walls were alive, reshaping themselves to trap her. No matter which direction she turned, the corridor stretched on endlessly as if mocking her, forcing her deeper into the bowels of the hospital. She couldn't remember which way she had come from. There was no longer any sense of direction, no familiar landmarks. The hospital had become a maze, its corridors shifting in ways she couldn't comprehend. A scream echoed from somewhere in the distance. It was shrill, distorted, a scream that felt like it came from every corner of the building at once. Amelia's blood ran cold. It was a scream of pure terror. The voice was unmistakable. It was hers. Her heart skipped a beat as the realization struck. The scream she had heard was her own. Somehow she had screamed without even realizing it, her fear manifesting into the very walls of the hospital. But there was something else, something far darker about the sound. It was distant, as though it had already happened, as though it were an echo of something that had occurred in the past. And then the whispers returned. "Amelia?" The voice was low and guttural, seeping from the very walls, wrapping around her, tugging at her mind. It was everywhere, inside her head, in the air, in her skin. "Amelia," it called again, sending a chill down her spine. The voice wasn't comforting. It wasn't even human. It was a thing, a force that knew her name, and it was getting closer. Amelia stopped dead in her tracks, her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. She could feel it. Something was in the hallway with her, something watching her from the dark. She turned slowly, her pulse hammering in her ears. The hallway behind her was empty, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long, stretched shadows that made the walls seem to breathe. But something was wrong. The shadows weren't just shadows, they were moving. The movement was subtle at first, a slight shift, like someone, or something, was hiding just beyond her line of sight. The darkness between the walls seemed to pulse, like it had a life of its own. Her skin prickled, and she instinctively took a step back. Her gaze flicked down to the floor. There were fresh footprints, dark smudges that led toward her, the path eerily clear in the otherwise empty hallway. They weren't hers. The print was too large, too heavy. Someone, or something, had been here before her. And it was close. A sound reached her ears. A low, dragging scrape, like something being dragged across the floor. Her heart skipped. She wasn't imagining it. It was real. The scraping grew louder, coming from just behind her. Amelia didn't turn around. She didn't want to see what was making that sound. She couldn't. Her mind was screaming at her to move, to get out of there, but her feet felt like they were stuck in place, frozen by fear. Then suddenly the lights above her flickered and went out completely. The hallway was plunged into darkness, suffocating and complete. She was blind, unable to see even the faintest outline of the walls around her. And then, from the absolute silence came the sound of breathing. Slow, ragged, uneven. It wasn't hers. Amelia's breath hitched. The sound was right behind her, too close, too intimate. She could feel the heat against her neck, like something was standing just inches away watching her. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, Amelia spun around, her eyes desperately searching the inky blackness. Nothing. The hallway was empty. But the breathing didn't stop. It was still there, lingering in the air. Amelia's chest tightened, the air in her lungs growing thicker, heavier. It felt as though the very walls were closing in around her, squeezing the life out of her. And then the whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. "Amelia?" It was a hiss, a whisper full of malice, coiling around her mind like a snake. It spoke her name again, dragging it out as if savoring the taste of her fear. In the pitch blackness, Amelia felt the darkness itself pulling at her, trying to suffocate her. She had to get away. She had to leave before it consumed her. And then, as if to taunt her, the lights flickered back on, casting everything in a cold, harsh light. She wasn't alone. Standing just a few feet away from her, in the middle of the hallway, was a figure. It was tall, far too tall, and its body seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its limbs were impossibly long, twisted in grotesque angles. Its face was obscured by darkness, but Amelia could see its eyes, wide, hollow black pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. For a moment, everything stopped. Time froze. And then, with a sickening jerk, the figure moved. Its limbs snapped forward, each step more erratic than the last, until it was standing right in front of her, too close. She could feel its breath on her skin, rancid and cold. Amelia wanted to scream, but her voice was stolen by the terror that gripped her throat. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She could only stand there, paralyzed by the horror of what stood before her. The figure raised its hand, a hand that was too large, too gnarled, and reached for her. Amelia's mind screamed at her to run, to fight, but her body wouldn't obey. Everything inside her screamed that this was the end, that there was no escape from the nightmare. She was trapped, and whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. "Please," Amelia whispered, her voice trembling. "Please no." The figure's mouth opened, a wide, unnatural grin splitting its face, its teeth jagged and sharp like broken glass. But there was no sound, no laughter, no noise at all, just the cold, suffocating silence that followed. Suddenly, the lights went out again, plunging the hallway back into darkness. And then there was nothing. The silence was deafening, oppressive. Amelia's breathing was the only sound in the void. She didn't know if she was alive or if she had already crossed over to some twisted version of reality. She didn't know where the creature had gone or what had happened to her. But she knew one thing for sure: she was not alone. In the darkness, she could hear it again. The whispers, the breathing, the slow, steady approach of something unnatural, something that wasn't finished with her yet. And this time, she knew it would never stop until it had taken her. Amelia's pulse was a rapid drumbeat in her ears as she stumbled through the darkness. Her feet were heavy, dragging against the floor as if they were stuck in thick mud. Each step felt like it was pulling her further into some impossible, suffocating void. The silence was unbearable. The kind of silence that gnaws at your mind, makes you question whether you're truly alone. The kind of silence where every creak, every whisper, feels like it's a threat waiting to strike. She didn't know how long she had been running, or if she was even still running. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her, and every turn felt like the same dark void. There were no signs, no windows, no doors, just walls closing in tighter with each breath. She had to escape. She had to wake up. Her hands trembled as she gripped the wall beside her, feeling the cold surface slick with moisture, almost as if the walls themselves were sweating. The air had thickened, pressing against her chest. It was stifling. The shadows twisted in unnatural ways, crawling along the floor, the ceiling shifting with malicious intent. Amelia's mind raced. Had she passed the same spot before? Had she already been here? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound. Faint, almost imperceptible at first. A scratching. It was so soft, so subtle, she might have thought it was her imagination if it didn't send a shiver down her spine. She stopped, holding her breath, straining to listen. The scratching grew louder, closer. It wasn't coming from behind her. It was coming from ahead. Something was in the darkness, something was moving, slowly, deliberately. Amelia's heart pounded. She wanted to turn and run, but her legs refused to move. The sound seemed to grow, its rhythm now synced with the pounding of her heart. She wasn't imagining it. Something, someone, was following her. The scratching stopped. The silence returned, and for a split second, Amelia thought she might have imagined the whole thing. But then she heard it, a low, guttural whisper just beyond her reach. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calling her name again. A voice, familiar yet distorted, full of hatred and malice. Amelia, Amelia. It echoed in her mind, bouncing off the walls, clawing at her sanity. She couldn't escape it. It was everywhere inside her head. She covered her ears, but it was no use. It only grew louder, more urgent, more desperate. Amelia? She couldn't take it anymore. She had to run. But as she turned, something caught her eye. A glimmer in the distance. A faint reflection. It was a mirror. A full-length mirror standing alone in the hallway. Her breath hitched in her throat. She hadn't seen it before. It wasn't here. It couldn't have been. It was an impossibility. The hallway had been empty moments before. The mirror's surface was cracked, jagged lines running through the glass like veins, distorting the reflection in eerie ways. The edges of the glass were stained, smeared with dark streaks that could have been dust, or something worse. Something twisted within her. She should have run. She should have kept moving, kept escaping, but the reflection, it beckoned her. Without thinking, her feet carried her toward it. She had no choice. It was as if the mirror was calling to her, pulling her closer with invisible strings. As she approached, her reflection in the cracked glass became distorted, her features warped, elongated. Her own face looked wrong, like a grotesque version of herself, a mockery. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the glass. Cold. Freezing. The moment her fingers made contact, the surface of the mirror rippled like water disturbed by a stone. Her reflection blinked at her. No, not her reflection, but something else. Something standing behind her. Amelia spun around, heart leaping into her throat. There was nothing there. But when she looked back at the mirror, she saw it again. The thing behind her. The figure. It was tall, too tall, its limbs long and distorted, its eyes hollow black pits that seemed to consume the light around them. The thing grinned at her, its mouth impossibly wide, full of teeth like jagged rocks. The figure in the mirror took a step forward. Its smile stretched even wider, its form flickering like a flame, unstable, shifting in and out of existence. Amelia recoiled, stumbling back. She turned to flee, but as she did, the mirror seemed to follow her. Its reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was real, solid, alive. It moved with her, mirroring her every action. But now something was wrong. The figure in the glass was no longer just an echo of her. It was moving on its own. Amelia's breath came in short, shallow gasps. She didn't know what was real anymore. The figure in the mirror twisted, its mouth widening, its body stretching unnaturally toward her. "Don't look away," the voice whispered again from the depths of the mirror. It wasn't just a whisper. It was in her mind. The words dripped like venom into her thoughts, poisoning her sense of reality. She felt an overwhelming urge to do what the voice commanded. Her body moved before her mind could process it, her eyes drawn back to the mirror. She couldn't stop herself. It was like the mirror was controlling her, pulling her into its depths. "No," she whispered, fighting it, struggling to tear her eyes away. But the reflection was too strong. The figure in the glass had now stepped out of the frame. It was no longer a reflection. It was real. A shadow loomed behind her, and she felt it, the presence, the dark weight of it, hovering over her, suffocating her. The figure in the mirror was right behind her now, inches away. Its breath, putrid and cold, brushed against her ear. She could feel it. She could smell it. A sharp, bone-chilling laugh filled the space. A laugh that came from the mirror, from the thing behind her. "Amelia?" The voice was clearer now, unmistakable. It was her own voice, but it wasn't her. It was mocking her, taunting her. It knew her every fear. Her hand shot out instinctively, slamming against the mirror, as though she could stop the thing from crossing into her world. But as soon as she touched the glass, her skin burned, searing with pain. It felt like 1,000 needles piercing through her hand. She cried out, pulling away, but the pain lingered. And that's when it happened. The mirror cracked. A sharp, violent sound split the air as the glass splintered, the cracks spreading like lightning. The figure in the glass screeched, its twisted face contorting in fury. But as the cracks widened, something shifted. Something behind the glass began to move. Amelia didn't wait to find out what it was. She turned, her legs moving on their own, fleeing down the hallway, her mind spinning. The darkness chased her. The whispers followed. And that thing, the figure, was still with her, still hunting her, waiting to claim her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. But the mirror's reflection was in her mind now, the horrible grin, the empty eyes, the dark, suffocating presence that would never let her go. And deep inside she knew she wasn't going to escape. Amelia couldn't remember how long she had been running. Her legs were heavy, sore, and each breath felt like it was being sucked from her lungs by an invisible force. The hallways twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, warping around her, always leading her deeper into the heart of the nightmare. Her mind was unraveling. She could feel the last remnants of her sanity slipping through her fingers. Each corner she rounded, each door she opened, brought her face to face with something darker, something far worse than anything she had imagined. She didn't know where she was anymore. The hospital, no, the building she was in, was no longer a place of healing. It had become a prison, an endless maze of twisting corridors and rooms that all seemed to lead to the same place. It was alive, breathing, watching her every move. She could feel the walls closing in, could feel the eyes of something unseen on her, waiting, watching, hungry. The figure in the mirror had followed her. She knew it had. Its presence had stalked her from the moment she had seen it, lurking in the corners of her mind, whispering to her, calling her name. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it there, its twisted face smiling at her from the shadows. It was always waiting, always hungry. And now it was closer than ever. She reached the end of another corridor. The walls seemed to stretch further than before, the shadows deeper, darker. She had no choice but to keep moving. She couldn't stop. He stopped, it would catch her. She knew it. She had to keep running, keep fighting. But then she stopped dead in her tracks. A door. It was different from the others. It stood at the far end of the hallway at the end of the maze. It was old, rusted, and covered in thick layers of grime, but there was something about it that drew her in. Something familiar, something wrong. She could feel it in her gut, the cold shiver running down her spine. The door beckoned to her, and against every instinct telling her to turn around, to run, she walked toward it. With each step, the whispers grew louder. They weren't just in her mind anymore. They were in the air, in the very walls around her. The sound was deafening, like thousands of voices all calling her name at once. Amelia? The door was just ahead now. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over the rusty handle. The voices seemed to be coming from behind the door, swirling around her, pulling at her. She could feel the cold emanating from it, like the air itself was frozen, the very threshold of something ancient. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't stop herself. She couldn't. The door, she had to open it. She had to see what was on the other side. It was the only way to escape. It had to be. With a final, shaky breath, Amelia pushed the door open. It creaked, the sound scraping against her nerves like nails on a chalkboard. As the door swung wide, the room beyond was revealed. It was a mirror. A massive, floor-to-ceiling mirror, framed in gold, surrounded by ornate carvings. The glass gleamed in the dim light, reflecting everything around her. But the reflection was wrong. The moment she stepped inside, she felt the shift. The room was no longer just a room. It was a void, a space that stretched endlessly in every direction, just like the hallways that had led her here. The reflections in the mirror weren't just her own. There were others, hundreds of them, all trapped within the glass, staring back at her with hollow, empty eyes. They were reaching for her, their hands pressed against the glass, begging her to join them. She stepped forward, her mind reeling. The reflection of her own face stared back at her, but it wasn't her. It couldn't be. Her reflection smiled at her, a smile that was not her own. It was distorted, twisted, like something was trying to force its way into her skin. And then it spoke. Amelia? The voice was a whisper, cold and hollow, like it came from the depths of the earth. It wasn't her voice. It was something else, something that had taken her form. The reflection's grin grew wider, its eyes darkening, hollowing out like empty pits of blackness. Amelia stepped back, her pulse pounding in her throat. But the reflection didn't move. It stayed in place, locked in its eternal smile. The whispers grew louder. The other figures in the mirror were screaming now, their voices distorted, mangled, as if they were being suffocated by the glass. Their hands pressed harder against the surface, their faces contorting with desperation. Amelia, the reflection called again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. The air grew colder. The floor beneath her feet trembled, and the room seemed to tilt, the walls warping, stretching, as if the very space was bending around her. She could feel it, the presence behind her, watching her, waiting for the moment when she would turn and face it. She had been running for so long. 4 hours, days, or maybe even longer she had been running. But now it was here. The thing that had been stalking her from the moment she had entered this cursed place had finally found her. She turned, her body moving of its own accord. She had no choice. The figure stood before her. It was tall, taller than any person had a right to be. Its limbs were impossibly long, its body twisted and malformed. Its face was a contorted mass of shadows, a blur of features that seemed to shift and melt before her eyes. Its eyes, however, were clear, black pits that seemed to absorb all light, all hope, all sanity. The smile that stretched across its face was inhuman, filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth, each one gleaming like broken glass. And then it spoke. Amelia? I've been waiting. The words sent a chill through her spine. Her heart stopped beating. The air in her lungs vanished. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. She couldn't even think. The figure stepped forward, its presence suffocating. The ground beneath her feet cracked, the very air twisting in unnatural ways. She tried to back away, but the figure's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a grip that was cold and unyielding. Its voice whispered once more, but now it was no longer just a voice. It was in her mind, crawling through her thoughts, rooting itself deep in her consciousness. You can't escape. You never could. The figure pulled her toward the mirror. And before she could even react, her reflection in the glass shifted, its eyes locking onto hers, and the glass began to ripple. It was pulling her in, warping, distorting, sucking her toward it. Amelia, the The reflection whispered, a soft promise, a final beckoning. Join us. Her body screamed for release. She fought with every ounce of strength, but it was useless. The reflection was not a reflection anymore. It was a portal. A doorway. The creature's grip tightened, dragging her toward the mirror, into the darkness beyond. And then, with one final deafening crack, Amelia was pulled through. The room went silent. The door to the room creaked shut. The hallway outside remained empty, the air still and thick with the lingering whispers. The mirror stood in the room as it had before, but now there was something new. A faint reflection, a distorted face staring out from behind the glass. Amelia's face, her smile, twisted, hollow. And as the figure in the mirror grinned wider, the reflection whispered with cold certainty, "You never leave."